Okay, well, Derek asked me just to give a brief introduction to the background to the book. I originally was approached by Routledge to edit a handbook on addiction. I didn't want to do that because yet another handbook. So I suggested to them that we could have a kind of handbook length edited volume focused on the brain disease model of addiction. This was because, in my view, the brain disease model had become dominant over the last 25 years. I think there'd be wide agreement with that. But at the same time, there had been a growing number of objections to it, and it seemed timely to bring all the arguments together, to bring the discussion together in a single volume. Certainly because it seems to me the most pressing issue which faces the addiction field at this time. Certainly the most pressing theoretical issue, but also I think one with very practical implications too, and perhaps that's something we can get onto later. So, having made that decision and got the interest of Routledge, I approached Matt Field and Tony Moss to join me as editors of the book at a conference at a Society for the Study of Addiction conference in Newcastle in 2015, and they agreed. And then we had a meeting between us, I think in Sheffield. We quickly decided that since the brain disease model was originally an American idea, and many of the supporters of it, and indeed critics, were in the United States, we needed an American. So the obvious choice was Sally Satel, who'd been the leading critic of the brain disease model in the US over the years, and we were delighted when she agreed to join us too. So that's 4 editors. And one thing to note, we're all members of the Addiction Theory Network, so we decided that we would style the book as being produced on behalf of the Addiction Theory Network. We wanted to invite a whole range of professional affiliations and scientific orientations to write chapters: neuroscientists, medics, including psychiatrists, obviously, behavioral scientists of various sorts, philosophers, social scientists, and lawyers, at least one lawyer, Stephen Morse, as usual. But we think that's a big strength of the book, that it covers the whole gamut of professional orientations interested in addiction. And also, we wanted to recruit people from as widely around the world as we possibly could, not just another Anglo-American book. I've seen too many books which are confined just to United States and UK speakers. And we want to include chapters from authors from mainland Europe, particularly Australia, and so on. Finally, and we wanted authors at all levels of seniority, from early career researchers to people with established reputations. But having said that, we aim to recruit all or most of the leading commentators on the brain disease model of addiction over the last few years. Now, we make no bones about opposition. We're all members of the Addiction Theory Network. Funny noises. And we're all generally opposed in somewhat different ways. There are differences between us in what is wrong with the brain disease model, but we're all generally opposed to it. And we make no bones about that in the book. But we didn't want to attack a straw man. We wanted to present the brain disease model as well as we possibly could. And we recognized early on that because the leading advocates of the brain disease model, I'm thinking of Nora Volkoff and George Koob, might be too busy to write original chapters for us. And that turned out to be the case. We did invite them and they graciously said, thank you very much, but we're too busy. So we decided to reprint classic papers in the literature defending the brain disease model, and I mean going right back to the early days of the model and following through, and so the book became a mixture of mostly original chapters. Most of the chapters are originally written, but there are addition of classics in the literature. Now, while we wanted to represent all the leading criticisms of the brain disease model and objections to it, we also recognized that there were some people who would be genuinely undecided about whether addiction should be termed a brain disease or not. And this was quite a respectable position to hold. Indeed, it was held by quite eminent people in the field. And so we wanted to represent that too. Finally, as well as criticisms of the brain disease model, the obvious objection to, well, what's the alternative? We wanted to present alternatives, scientific alternatives to the brain disease model. We're strongly of the view that rejecting the brain disease model does not mean going back to a moral model. There are alternative scientific ways of approaching, of explaining addiction. So we wanted a section on that too. So with all that in mind, if I can get hold of these slides. There is the structure of the book. First of all, there's a general introduction written by all of us, agreed by all of us. And then section 1 is for the brain disease model with classic reprinted papers, Leshner, Volkov et al., and so on. We can talk more later about what they are, or Matt Field will. And I don't want to move on to that one yet. What's happened here? Take back? I don't know. Derek, what on earth is happening here? Do you know?
Stop presenting.
I
don't know what's happening. Let me see if I can.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Well, I'll just carry on then. Then there's a section against the brain disease model, people who unequivocally think it's wrong. Then the section I mentioned, which is quite a brief section, about, I think, 5 chapters of people who are unsure for a whole bunch of reasons. I think Matt Field is going to talk about that as well. And then finally, quite a long section on alternatives to the brain disease model. These are obviously people who've objected to the brain disease model, but want to present an alternative way of looking at it. And finally, ending up with concluding comments at the end. And I'll come back and speak about those concluding comments at the end of the webinar. Okay, that's it, Derek. Thank you.
Matt, do you want to go next? Or maybe if you start presenting, then that should help.
Yeah, I will. Oops. Oh, right, just a second. Hello, right, so first of all, let me see if this works. Right, can you see that? Can you see those slides?
Yes.
Brilliant, right, I'll just put it in presenter view. Yeah, first of all, it's really nice to see so many people I know, so people I'm currently working with or have worked with in the past, or people who I haven't worked with but I know, so thanks to everyone for coming. Yeah, so my brief is to talk about, just give a brief overview of 2 of the sections in the book, and the first one is the chapters which make the case for the brain disease model of addiction. So we include, right, these aren't working. Let's see if I can. Okay, I did have. What we've got is we reprint the first 2 chapters in the book are reprints of 2 of the most influential papers in the field, which set out the main tenets of the brain disease model. So the first one is the paper by Alan Leshner from 1997, which has been cited over 2,000 times in the last 25 years. So that, you know, that's a huge amount of citations, and that's the one that really kind of articulated the brain disease model and sketched it out, and its treatment and policy implications back 25 years ago. And it was fairly light on details, but of course a lot of things happened over the last 25 years. And in 2016, Volkov, Kuban, McClellan published a much more detailed account of the brain disease model, which really describes a lot of the neuroadaptations that happen in addiction, again, it makes a kind of strong case for why we should recognize addiction as a brain disease in terms of improvements in treatment and understanding, and also things like medical insurance, and also influences on policy. And again, that's been extremely highly cited, more than 1,300 citations of that work. Some other highly influential classics that we cited are this paper by Heilig and colleagues from 2016, which doesn't now. This one particularly emphasizes the importance of studying social factors in the context of addiction. But what this Heilig paper does is emphasizes social factors as things which ultimately moderate the expression of the underlying brain disease. So still very much focused, still very much a neurocentric view, but it is an acknowledgement that it's important to model social factors, particularly in animal models. And then the final reprinted chapter in this section is a chapter from Everett and Robbins, 2016. Again, very highly cited. That's in the Annual Review of Psychology. Now, Everett and Robbins don't use the term brain disease model in this or in any of their papers, but their work, mainly from animal studies and also from brain imaging studies in humans, has been it's been really important in terms of understanding what happens in the brain as addiction develops, and it really provides the basis for various flavors of the brain disease model. So we felt it was important for these works to be represented here. But it is important to be clear that although both of these are really important papers for addiction neuroscience, certainly Everett and Robbins don't explicitly advocate for the brain disease model. Okay, and then finally we have 2 original chapters in this section. So one is by Kent Berridge. I'm just going to briefly summarize what this says. So firstly, is addiction a brain disease? The incentive sensitization view. And his argument is, so many of you might be familiar with the incentive sensitization theory. And Kent Berridge's argument is that dopaminergic sensitization, which occurs as a consequence of chronic drug use, will manifest as craving and salience attribution. And his argument is that this neuroadaptation does justify the label of a brain disease, and that's the essence of his argument. However, he also notes that this dopaminergic sensitization subverts or distorts choice rather than completely bypasses it, and therefore this has a possibility for reconciliation with other models of addiction which don't rely on brain disease and behavioral features such as compulsion and habit, which are closely linked to it. And another original chapter is from Gabriel Segal, which is addiction is a brain disease, but does it matter? And this is very much there's a couple of themes in there. One is that it talks about how addiction is characterized in the teachings of 12-step groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and so on. And those groups very much talk about addiction as a form of brain disease, or at least as a disease, and really the way that it's articulated in the big book is consistent with the idea of a brain disease. And I think in essence, you can argue that because AA is effective, 12-step groups are effective, therefore there may well be some truth in their understanding of addiction. His other argument is that many of our contributors kind of tackle this issue, in that actually it's really hard to define what a disease is, let alone to define what a brain disease is. So everything's very ambiguous and lots of fuzzy boundaries. But one of his concluding comments is there's no useful interpretation of brain disease, in quotes, under which addiction isn't one. And my personal reflection, which I'm not sure, I can't say is shared with my co-editors, is that when I read these, I found both of them very persuasive. To the extent on first reading, I did question why we were editing the book in the first place. I can't see Nick, he's probably swearing at me, but I did subsequently realise that this is so these are really good. Anyway, these are really good arguments for, but obviously the other chapters and the other chapters in the other sections make the case for why it isn't. And now things move fast. It's a shame you can't see these slides. You can't see the things I've put in the images, but basically. Two things have been published since then. Now, one of them is the new paper by Heilig et al., which was published about this time last year, which Nick's going to say more about in his concluding comments. And then the final one is a paper by Henrietta Bowden-Jones and colleagues, published in Lancet Psychiatry a few weeks ago. Now, this is really this is about gambling disorder and priorities for research and treatment into gambling disorder. But when I read this paper, I was struck by how very neurocentric it is, and how, again, they don't use the term brain disease, but very much their priorities are understanding more about what goes wrong in the brain in people with gambling disorder. And I was struck by how little emphasis there is on many of the other determinants of gambling problems, such as the commercial determinants. So I guess I just highlight these two recent things to emphasize that the brain disease model is still very much influential. People are still passionately arguing for it, and these things appeared even after the book was finished. Okay, thank you. I will stop, and I'm going to hand over to Nick or Sally. I can't remember.
Sally.
Sally, you'll have to unmute yourself again, please.
Right? Yes?
Yes, that's you.
Okay. So I was in the in charge of the against section, which came very naturally to me. So there are 15 chapters in our section, and I should say I was in a way I was there at the beginning. Even though Alan Leshner's seminal article came out in Science in 1997, I was at a meeting in 1995 that was sponsored by NIDA, and it was for people who got grants from NIDA, basically. And I remember Alan Leshner presenting to the audience, in fact, actually taking a poll of the audience to find out how many of them thought the formulation of addiction as a brain disease, or in its full iteration, a chronic and relapsing brain disease, was a good idea. You know, it was something NIDA should embrace as a well, he didn't use the word slogan, but there is a sloganism dimension to it. But anyway, as their definition of addiction. And I remember thinking, I didn't quite agree with it, but I also thought maybe that tells you, you know, all you need to know if this definition has come about as a matter of voting on it. But in any case, the main reason, almost every one of the chapters mentions this. So the main reason that addiction, I don't even want to say is not a brain disease. I want to say is less productively thought of as a brain disease. This is how I and my colleague Scott Lilienfeld, unfortunately, who's passed away almost 2 years ago, we think about it, it's just not the most productive way to think about it. And the reason is because it encourages, and depending on who's articulating it, almost demands a misplaced emphasis on only one explanatory dimension of addiction. I mean, there are so many. There is the brain level, there's the psychological level, there's the behavioral level, there's the social level, there's the environmental level, there's the cultural level. And these all are relevant to the etiology and also the resolution of addiction. And they're in any individual, some of those levels may be more relevant at for one individual than another. In the same individual, some might be more important at some point in the addiction process than others. For example, if you're in the midst of an intense withdrawal phase, your biology is effectively taken over. But as you're getting further into recovery, then the social domains mean a lot more. So basically, to say addiction is a brain disease, as Wolfgang Pauli says, the famous Nobel Prize winner of physics, physicist, it's not even wrong. It can't be affirmed, it can't be denied, and it's fundamentally philosophical. So, and if something is in that realm, you could say, well, then whether something is a brain disease or not, or anything, frankly, it would depend on the definition you set for it. You could operationalize it, as Alan Leschner did, which is to say that addiction is, I think his phrase was, fundamentally a brain disease because it causes neurological changes in the brain. Well, of course it does. Everything does. And to say that that's the basis for something being a brain disease is inadequate because, as I said, almost everything causes changes in the brain. So if addiction is a brain disease, that can't be a good reason why. We did reprint that chapter by Volkow and Koob. It was a 2015 article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and in which they expressed, I think they even used the word surprised, that the brain disease formulation would even be questioned. And it's funny, they didn't cite any of the questioners, but that's fine. And they said that the more we learn about the brain, there was like, okay, doubters, once we learn more about the brain, then your objections or skepticism will dissolve, because not only will we have greater proof that it's a brain disease, because we will understand the brain mechanisms more fully, we will develop more treatments. And it's possible that more treatments will follow the more we understand the brain. I'm skeptical, but I'm certainly open to it. But their basic notion was the more we learn about the brain, the more you'll believe it's a brain disease. It's just not compelling to me and others in our section, because all that will mean is we will know more about the neurobiological level of analysis of addiction. I mean, we could say the same thing about, the other levels. So, gee, if we learn more about personality in the development of addictions, then then we'll have a more complete explanation of how that's relevant. If we learn more about the cultural and environmental influences, then we'll learn more about how the environment works, but we're not going to be calling it an environmental or a social or a spiritual or a psychological disease. Personally, I consider addiction a behavioral condition because, you could look at brain scans all day, and which Koob and Volkow largely do. And I should say, if that sounds cynical, it's not. It's brilliant technology, and I'm in awe of it. But you can look at brain scans all day, and it won't tell you whether someone's an addict, because addiction is a behavior. You have to act like an addict to be an addict. And from brains, at least at this point, we can't tell whether an impulse to use drugs was irresistible or was resisted. And irresistibility is also one of the implications of the brain disease model and why it's problematic. And I think once we say that whether something's a brain disease or not, in the case of addiction, that's more philosophical than anything. I mean, then we can get into the problematic implications of it. I mean, I don't think it's fair to say that because, let's say, the brain disease model has bad implications is a reason why it can't be a brain disease. But since we've established, I believe, that it's not a brain disease, because we don't know how one would even define a brain disease. And I should say that's what Hannah Picard's very, very interesting and deep chapter is about, is what would allow us to say it's a brain disease, which is very, very interesting. You know, she's a philosopher, and she talks about you know, how we would delineate it in a causal model, as I say, how you would even conceptualize a cause. It's a very complicated chapter, but I think it's very, very interesting, and questions that most people don't ask about it. So that's very important. And as I was saying, once you know, we look at it in this sort of almost philosophical way, we can bring in all other kinds of objections to why it shouldn't be considered a brain disease. And I'm going to get to those in a minute, but I briefly want to say also that there are some incorrect facts that are invoked by the brain disease proponents. As I said before, they often call it a chronic and relapsing condition. And, you know, tautologically, it's chronic and relapsing, and people in whom it's chronic and relapsing. Statistically, actually, most people's addictions resolve probably around age 30. This is Gene Heyman's work, and he has a chapter as well. Also, a brain disease model implies that treatment is always needed. It's often needed, but in fact, most people don't get it, and many more probably should than do. But the point is, not everyone does need it. Also, brain disease would imply that medications are almost always indicated. Look, I work at a methadone clinic. I'm all for medications. But again, you know, it leads to that implication of medications being essential. Also, a brain disease, folks say often that it's analogous to other chronic medical conditions, and that analogy doesn't hold up in many ways. And the other very important logical point is that, you know, even though, as Al Leshner says, and he's right, that there are brain changes in addiction, it'd be stunning if there weren't. The question is, what do those brain changes, I mean, an easier way to say is, what do they preclude? And they don't preclude a response to contingencies. That's carrots and sticks. And that, from a behavioral level, is kind of the essence of voluntarism, is whether you can, or whether something is voluntary. It's whether you can foresee consequences and modify your behavior on the basis of that foresight. And we know that's true in addiction. When you take a different kind of brain disease, like Alzheimer's, for example, and you might say to a patient with Alzheimer's, well, he or she is still in a phase where he can understand what you're saying to him. You know, if your memory worsens, if it declines anymore, we're going to shoot your dog. And if it doesn't, if you can control your memory deterioration, we're going to give you $1 million. That would be a ridiculous kind of proposition for someone with the kinds of brain changes that inhere in something like Alzheimer's, because the person does not have that kind of capacity to respond to contingencies. But we know there's tons of literature about how people, you know, with addiction do. They can respond to these kind of carrots and sticks, and they also respond to cognitions and the emotions that the cognitions evoke. So, for example, everybody in my methadone clinic is there because, I mean, everyone is there because either, you know, their wife was going to leave them, their parole officer was going to violate them, their kids, they're worried their kids don't love them anymore because they've never been to any of their plays or baseball games. I mean, again, someone with, you know, a child could express resentment of a parent because they're not fully attentive to them because they have Alzheimer's, but that's not going to change the course of Alzheimer's. So these are all dimensions of a condition that doesn't fit with the classic notion of a brain problem, which is that a person can't control it. I'll finish up by just quickly going through the kinds of concepts that the chapters, many of the chapters touch on. And as I said before, since we're largely in the realm of philosophy and not fact, we can, I think it's fair to talk about the bad consequences and misleading implications of a reductive model like addiction. I want to emphasize that just because something has bad implications doesn't mean it's wrong. But in this case, because we can't determine whether it's wrong or not, we could very much determine that it's not productive because it limits us too much. We can talk about misleading implications, and I think that's fair. So we have a chapter by James Morris who talks about how mechanistic explanations, such as genetic or neurobiologic ones, in this case neurobiologic, are inconvenient and negative because they lead people to think that the person who is suffering from this genetics or neurobiological or biological problem can't control themselves and could possibly be dangerous. I mean, this is I think we're getting into moral intuitions here, but that's what people draw from the inference that there's something wrong with your brain, that you're unpredictable and possibly violent. So in response, there is a natural aversion to people with these kinds of brain problems. And also there is a therapeutic nihilism that is evoked as well, which is to say that people probably can't respond to treatment. Which are not true, but those come along with these kinds of conceptualizations of behavior as being neurobiologically motivated. Well, of course, it all is fundamentally, but we call it a brain disease. Lee Hogarth says that a brain disease model leads us to ignore interventions or really downplay interventions at these other levels of analysis. Again, the psychological, behavioral, social. Bruce Alexander has I'm sure he'll talk about a lot more in the next meeting, but really a savage indictment of the brain disease. It's also a little anti-American, but I didn't take any offense, about how income inequality, it diverts us from working on income inequality. Psychologist Fred Rotgers talks about how it's unethical because it diminishes self-efficacy and self-image. Then we have a chapter by Wayne Hall and with Adrian Carter and Cynthia Fortini, who says that we ignore, there's a lot of overlap in the chapters, but they're all also very different, it hasn't, the brain disease hasn't inspired any new treatments, which is interesting. And I'm sure a very big disappointment to its proponents because they thought it would. Of course, that's true of, unfortunately, in most of psychiatry. We haven't had radically new treatments in quite a while. Richard Hammersley talks about how, we're humans and not brains, and humans are very ambivalent about giving up things that soothe them and that reward them. And this explains why people are reluctant to go into treatment often and why they often leave it early, because they're so ambivalent. And again, a brain disease model would not incorporate that. Mark Lewis, chapter 19, talks about how addiction is grounded in normal neurobiological processes, even if the behavior that results is somewhat is pathological. Derek Heim and Rebecca Marks make the observation that addiction is something people do, not something that happens to them. They're not passive. They're not involuntary, again, as a brain disease model implies. And finally, Stephen Morse, who's a law professor, American, he talks about the failure of the brain disease model in court and how it was invoked to basically exonerate someone and how it didn't work. I'll close by saying that Tim Layton emphasizes how much the brain disease idea is very much an idea as opposed to a reality. I mean, clearly, there are brain changes, but whether that means it's a brain disease, again, becomes a philosophical matter. And so his suggestion is that the brain disease model has outlived its usefulness and it should be retired. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Sally. Tony, do you want to take over now?
I think it's Nick next.
Derek, wouldn't it be more logical to go to Matt first? For the unscores, quickly?
I'll leave it to you guys to decide. Sorry, Matt.
Sorry, it's me, I think. Yeah. Okay, so yes, so we had section 3 is for chapters for authors who were unsure about the brain disease model of addiction for a number of different but interesting reasons. So we have six chapters in this section by Serge Ahmed, which relates to preclinical work, so work with laboratory animals. And then from an Australian group led by Anthony Barnett, so which is concerned with how people who provide addiction treatment in Australia, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the brain disease model in that context? And then we have 2 chapters from Scandinavian authors on again quite distinct, balancing the ethical and methodological pros and cons, and a project from Matilda Hellman and Michael Egerer about the epistemic project of addiction in the brain. Then we have the chapter by Hannah Pickard, which has just been briefly referred to, about what does it even mean to say that something's a disease, let alone a brain disease. And then finally, we have a chapter from Maeva Flavel and colleagues which is really concerned with behavioral addictions. But there's some lessons we can learn there about how behavioral addictions are being generated, if you like. New behavioral addictions are being generated, and what this tells us about the kind of undue influence of the brain disease model. So just to say a bit more about them then, so the chapter by Serge Ahmed, he talks about both animal studies with animals, but also human epidemiological studies. And his argument is that the evidence cannot arbitrate. Basically, both types of evidence cannot tell us if addiction's a disease, or they cannot arbitrate between disease and choice models. And the essence of this argument is that in both cases, in human epidemiological studies, but also in animal research, where you give rodents a choice between taking drug or an alternative reinforcer like saccharin, what you'll find is that the majority of people will recover, and the majority of rodents will choose the alternative reinforcer, and the majority of people will recover without treatment. Who should we be focusing our explanation on? Do we focus it on the majority who are basically sensitive to environmental contingencies and can change, or the minority who seem to have more difficulty doing so? His overarching, Serge Ahmed primarily does animal research, but his argument is that animal models have not really been able to emulate the important environmental drivers of addiction and recovery in humans, although things have definitely improved a lot over the last 5 years or so. Okay, the chapter by Barnett et al. So this is about Australian treatment providers, and really what this emphasizes is that actually explaining to people who are suffering from addiction problems that something has gone wrong with their brain, and that should be the target for treatment, can be helpful in some settings. So in kind of regular treatment, but also in kind of mutual aid, AA settings. And they also make this nice general point that the notions of bench to bedside translation of addiction neuroscience research are pretty oversimplified. So it's not the case that we discover something, a neuroadaptation in addiction, which then leads to treatment, and which leads to an improvement in the way that we can understand addiction and explain to people with addiction why they behave in the way that they do. But actually, it's a lot more complicated than that, and that's not how research gets translated. It gets kind of misconstrued and used in different ways, and so on. And this also has implications for treatment policy. It's an important point that they make. So what kind of treatments should we favor? Should we invest our resources in, and which ones should be, because it's a zero-sum game, which ones should we disinvest in? Okay, next two chapters, so by Usitalo and Kurikovsky. There again, this one theme that crops up again in many chapters is that an overly narrow focus on the brain disease model can lead to neglect of environmental or social determinants and interventions, which crops up several times. However, you can't neglect those neuroadaptations, and effective treatment and policy require an understanding of those and placing them in their appropriate context, but they can't be completely neglected. And their concern is that if we were to completely reject the brain disease model, this would have many unintended consequences. And again, that's a point that's raised in a number of other chapters, including the one by Kent Berridge in the first section. Moving on to Hellman and Eggerer, they describe work from this big project they've been doing called the Epistemic Project of Addiction in the Brain. And that's really concerned with the brain disease model in how addiction's understood in a number of different contexts. And the ones they focus on are treatment settings. So there's some overlap with the work from Barnett and colleagues, but also treatment. So how do we tell usually adolescents about the brain disease model of addiction, and how do we employ that knowledge? But also in terms of media reporting, how do we explain the latest research on addiction and addiction treatment to the general public? And in each case, their argument is that the brain disease model provides some fairly simple narratives that have at least symbolic value in each of those contexts, even if the underlying science is more complicated and ambiguous than those narratives can hope to convey in those settings. So again, they're wary of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you like, in that it has a number of values, a number of brain disease framing has a number of values in these different contexts. So Sally talks about Hannah Pickard's chapter, but just to say a bit about this one. So Pickard talks about what is a disease, and in particular, what is a brain disease? Then to answer that, we have to know what a healthy brain looks like, and that's really hard to pin down. And a separate but related point is, well, how do those brain changes cause the behavioral features of addiction? So again, to go back to what the points that have already been made, addiction's a behavioral disorder, but it's not easy to explain how those brain adaptations, or the brain disease, if you like, actually translates into those behavioral those features. And if we can't answer those questions, then the bigger question, which is addiction a brain disease, that's really impossible to answer. And another point, which is again picked up on a number of other chapters, is that we shouldn't assume that acceptance of the brain disease model will reduce stigma and blame. And that's particularly if we continue to moralize about drug use. So this is a point that Hannah's made in a number of recent papers, that a lot of the problem is the fact that we take this very Puritan, this very moralistic view of drug use, when there's not really any sensible reason to hold those views. The final chapter by Flyelatel is concerned with behavioral addictions, and their argument here is that addiction should be defined by its core psychological features. So we shouldn't actually, looking at the diagnostic criteria in the DSM and the ICD are not very helpful. And their kind of case study, as you like, is behavioral addictions. So gambling disorder is recognized in both the diagnostic manuals. Gaming disorder is in the ICD, but not in the DSM. And no other candidate behavioral addictions are registered. They feature in the diagnostic manuals, but a number have been proposed, ranging from things to internet addiction, social media addiction, and Harry Potter addiction, tango dancing addiction. So it's a great topic to teach undergraduates, but the reason that a lot of these addictions have been proposed is because we take this very biologically oriented explanation of addiction, and also we try to emulate the diagnostic criteria, and we try to apply those to a number of other behaviors. And this has left the behavioral addictions field in a bit of a confused mess. Okay, so that's that chapter, and I will now hand over to Tony, who's going to talk about the final section. Sorry.
Wonderful, thanks, Matt. Hopefully you can see those slides there. So I think, as Nick said at the start, we in the alternative section had actually quite a number of chapters, and I'm going to show just on here, partly because I hope there are some colleagues here that may have contributed to this section. I won't be able to reference every single one of these chapters as we go through, and that's by no means a sales pitch to try and encourage you to buy the book, but of course please do buy the book. But I just wanted to kind of give an overview here of the range of contributions that we've had. And the way that we tried to summarise, I guess, what came out of this section was to really sort of thematise the different things that the authors of these chapters were doing with regards to developing alternatives to the brain disease model of addiction. And there was really quite an interesting range of different approaches that authors made. And I'll go on to the second slide there that shows the other contributors. I suppose the first thing, the thing that really struck me reading through the contributions that we received from colleagues in this area, was it really resonated with something that's always sort of stuck in my mind about addiction and addiction theory, and particularly when I've been teaching undergraduate and postgraduate students over a number of years now, is almost this sense of if you think you understand it, you're probably wrong. Because actually, you know, one of the fundamental issues certainly I have with the brain disease model of addiction is that it feels so definite, it feels so conclusive that, you know, we know that it's a brain disease, and even if we haven't got the evidence, you know, we're going to get there. Don't worry, we're going to get there. It's definitely a brain disease. And I think what's reflected across this range of contributions in this final section of the book is actually there are lots of really interesting questions that remain, you know, massively unanswered in many ways. And so just to sort of talk through, and I will refer to some of those chapters that I just put up on the screen as we go through. The first kind of theme, or the first sort of approach, if you like, that was taken in this section was from colleagues who were arguing that we need to reframe the debate and ask the question in a different way, that maybe the problem, part of the problem is we are asking the wrong question. And one particular chapter was a reprint of an article from Don Ross, a philosopher and an economist who many colleagues here will be familiar with, who made the argument that part of the problem is that it depends on the level of analysis. If you think addiction is a disease, it depends on your level of analysis. His argument in the chapter, which is quite an interesting one I found, was that at the public health level and an epidemiological level, addiction may present as a disease. That, you know, if you're looking at things at a very high level, it may seem that a disease or a disorder construct, not necessarily a brain disease or brain disorder construct, but the disease or disorder construct may have some practical utility. But his argument was that the imposition of that at the individual level is where it becomes problematic. And certainly not at the level of clinical management and intervention. Now, that even in itself is an interesting debate, I think, in part because, of course, there are many individuals for whom the disease label, the disease model, is actually an important intrinsic part of recovery for some individuals. In this same sort of vein of argument, there was a chapter from Helen Keane, David Moore and Susan Fraser, the Australian sociologists, who in their chapter, I think the sort of title of their chapter sums it up really quite nicely, and it's the which brain disease model, when, for whom, and for what cost. And their argument here throughout their chapter was that part of what we need to be doing is understanding what different versions of the brain disease model are actually doing, because their argument is that there isn't a singular version of the brain disease model of addiction. There are lots of different biomedical perspectives on addiction, but each of them perform slightly different functions. And so, as you would expect, coming from a more sociological perspective, there are some really interesting ideas explored in their chapter around the sort of the function of the theory, if you like, what it is that those theories are doing in practice. In the second overarching theme, there was this more sort of meta-reflective discussion about the way that we actually do addiction science. And I found this really interesting, essentially sort of asking questions about the difficulty of studying the phenomenon of addiction. And I think that has always, and I've again certainly reflected on my own teaching practices, I've often said to students, this is a really complicated area to get your head around because it's impossible to study it. You know, I'm a psychologist, I can teach you about the psychology of addiction, but if I don't teach you about social inequality and about, you know, elements of, you know, neurobiology and pharmacology and so on, you won't even begin to start developing a good understanding of what addiction really is. And so that complexity as a very multidisciplinary field is argued part of what creates the problems in the way that we frame our understanding of addiction. There's a particular interesting chapter from Jessica Storbjork and colleagues reflecting on the Nordic model, which is often in debates about the brain disease model sort of used as an example of an area where taking a more social model of addiction has been successful. What was interesting in that chapter is that it was written more as a cautionary tale, about how even taking that more, what may be seen by many of us as a more progressive approach to understanding and thinking about and supporting people with problems of addictive behaviour. In Storbjork's chapter, she talks about how over time that position has been eroded and has actually almost been hijacked in some ways by a more restrictive biomedical perspective. She makes the argument in the chapter that part of that is that biomedical science is, is sometimes conflated with the notion of evidence-based practice, and that those two things can become sort of almost implicitly too closely aligned, and therefore harm reduction initiatives may fall out of favour. And I think that comes back to a point I think James touched upon, Matt touched upon, my colleague James Morris, who speaks about stigma and addiction. I think part of that plays a significant role in these processes as well, particularly when you've got policymakers and politicians who aren't expert in the field and maybe reliant on more general ideas about what they think addiction really is. In the same vein around communication, there's work that colleagues may be aware of from Robert West and colleagues, and in the book, a chapter written by Robert Kelly and other colleagues around the idea of an addiction ontology. This idea that actually, before we even get to asking questions like is addiction a disease, we actually need to go right down to basics and start defining the terms that we're using, as has happened, in fact, in other areas of biomedical science. Colleagues will be familiar with some of the ontologies that exist in the biomedical science disciplines. And again, that's another interesting kind of meta perspective, if you like, on the way that the addictions field operates more broadly, is that actually we can often be quite fast and loose with terminology and say the same terms but mean quite different things. And so that was another, I think, interesting contribution in terms of how it is that we can move ourselves forward as a discipline and improve our understanding by actually being more precise about the things that we're saying, particularly, I guess, when we're communicating cross-disciplinary disciplinary fields. So in the final sort of overarching theme, and this is the one where you might hope to get some real sort of solid answers, is, well, if addiction is not a brain disease, then what is it? And we had a number of really in-depth contributions from colleagues in this section, making attempts to explain, well, if it's not a brain disease, what is it? Are we left with an explanatory void that we say it's not a brain disease and it's not a moral failure, it's something else and we don't yet know? And there were some really interesting contributions, for example, from Paul Verschure and Reinhard Weiers, who have, and I think that, many of you may be familiar with this line of argument or from previous contributions that they've made to the field, that it's not that it's not a brain disease, it's not that there is no element of neurobiology, it's just not the most important part. And effectively they construct what's sort of broadly described as a biopsychosocial approach to understanding addiction. We also had a contribution from Gabor Mate, again, as you'd be familiar with Mate's work, focuses on the role that trauma plays, and so understanding addiction more from the etiology, why it is that people may develop problems with addictive behaviour in the first place. A particular chapter that jumped out for me, I think, was a contribution. I think it jumped out at me for a number of reasons, not least of which is I think it's probably quite distinct from many of the others, was a contribution from Beth Collinson and David Best, who presented what I'd sort of could describe almost as a pragmatic theory that very much values the role of people's lived experience of addiction and using that to centre the way that we understand and talk about and define our terms in the field of addiction. I found that really quite an appealing chapter in the sense that, the experimental psychologist in me thinks, well, that's great, that's really important, but it's not getting down to the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of what addiction as a thing is, as an entity is. But at the same time, it also struck me as an approach that may well be of greatest utility to the people who are experiencing harms from addiction more broadly, that actually centering those lived experiences is a really useful way to gain a lens and an insight into what it is that we're all talking about. In the final chapter that was contributed from Bruce Alexander, the second of his chapters in our book, there was a really, I think, a fascinating exploration, I guess, around what was described, I think, as a sort of a social dislocation and understanding addiction in a much broader social context. And Alexander, in his chapter, sort of argues that we shouldn't be asking, that we're asking the wrong question. If we ask what is addiction, we're asking the wrong question. He suggests that what we should be asking is what is it addiction does. And that was a really interesting contribution in the way that he frames that in the context of what he argues is a more dissipated society and so on and so forth was interesting. But it also, I guess, from a sort of a behavioural perspective, from a behavioural psychological perspective, the idea of taking a functional approach to understanding any form of behaviour is by no means novel. But I think it's really interesting in the way that he argues through the chapter that we are asking the wrong question, that by focusing certainly lots of our investment and energy into expensive neurobiological research isn't producing benefit, and perhaps what we're failing to miss are some of those questions about the function of the behaviour. Just my own sort of personal reflection on particularly the whole text itself, but this chapter in particular. I guess where it sort of leaves me is that actually the most important thing that we can all do is accept that we don't yet fully know, and that there's a sort of humility in accepting that there are some really interesting perspectives, and that the best thing we can do is try and avail ourselves of the knowledge that colleagues have to offer across various different areas. And at the same time also, and I think this is what I really took away from the Collinson and Best chapter, was making sure that during the period of time that we're trying to get our heads around from a scientific perspective, what is addiction, that we're also trying to focus on the fact that there are people suffering and experiencing harm, and the best thing we could do is to try and do things that help those people. So yeah, that was me, and I think now I'm handing back to Nick.
Okay, Derek, is that your chairing?
Yes, thank you. I just want to round things up so we can then open up for some discussion. There's already been some notable contributions in the chat.
All right. Look, I'm very conscious of the fact that we're running out of time, and as Derek says, we want to leave time for discussion. So I'm going to really abbreviate what I intended to say about the concluding chapter. I mean, the first thing that strikes me just listening to this webinar is that, I think we can say that we produced a book which is absolutely teeming with ideas on this subject. If you like, a smorgasbord. I don't think readers will will read the book and say, I understand, why addiction is not a brain disease. No definite conclusion. We wanted, I think, to open up the debate and to present as many valid arguments and facets of the argument as we could, and I think we've succeeded in doing that. The concluding chapter is one that I'm very keen on. I mean, I find in books I've edited and written previously, everybody ignores your concluding remarks. It's not often cited. I'd be disappointed if that would happen in this case, because I think it's an important chapter. We didn't try to summarize everything. Of course, that would be impossible. But what we did is this. Matt already mentioned a paper by Marcus Heidegger and colleagues that came out in Neuropsychopharmacology, which was kind of the brain disease model revisited, a defense of it, an updated brain disease model, taking into account various criticisms that had been made. Now, that was published. We invited Marcus to write a chapter. He declined, he was too busy, so we reprinted his 2016 paper. But it was too late to reprint his later paper last year, which we would have liked to do. We did try to get a commentary on the paper in the journal, and we sent in an abstract, but they rejected our proposal. And there were a couple of commentaries on it, a short one by Robert and Ron and some others. So, I mean, that was rather annoying. So what we decided to do was devote this last chapter to responding to the Heilig et al. Now, I mean, the Heilig et al. Paper is definitely a retreat, if you like. It makes quite clear concessions to criticisms that have been made. I won't have time to go through them all in detail, but it admits, for example, that criticizing the brain disease model does not necessarily imply that you favor a moral model, that you can have alternative scientific accounts. It admits that addiction is not chronic or relapsing anymore, And it admits that brain images by themselves don't prove that addiction is a brain disease. These are important concessions to make, so we can move forward on that basis. But it is also at the same time confused in a number of ways. And it still conflates neuroscience and the brain disease model. It mixes up the brain disease concept with the more general disease concept, and so on. Please read the chapter for these replies to their defense of the brain disease model. Importantly, what we say, and something I'm very keen on, is what Tim Layton in his chapter refers to as the Mariological Fallacy. This comes from an important book by Bennett and Hacker on the philosophical foundations of neuroscience. I'm looking at it on my shelf right now, and it says more or less that addiction is a property of the whole person, not a part of the person, that is, not of the brains. That a description of the activity of the brain can never amount to a satisfactory explanation of addiction. And I recommend you to read Tim's chapter and to also the book that I just mentioned. And finally, we deal with their argument that rejecting a brain disease model would lead to limitations on access to healthcare and would be a catastrophe, I think is the word they use, for the treatment and care of individuals having social addiction. We reject that argument. I invite you to look at that, at our reasons for doing so. We end up by using this word consilience, which is the term that Heidegger et al. Use in the title of their chapter. Consilience, if you look it up in the dictionary, means some kind of common ground from the humanities and the science. I think in this case from social and psychological science and neuroscience. And they're more or less saying, let's all get together, guys, and come together to unite in explaining addiction. Our reply to that is that that's all very well, but the kind of consilience that they have in mind it still has neuroscience in charge. Neuroscience is still the fundamental discipline, and the others are still kind of hangers on. So we're very much in favor of consilience. We see that as the way forward, but not on the terms that they propose. So, as somebody said before, buy the book, read the chapters, and contribute to the debate. Over to Derek.
Thank you very much to all our speakers, and can I invite people who've already made some comments in the chat. So Richard Hammersley, Tim Layton, Alexander Nicolescu. If any of you would like to put any questions to our speakers or contribute discussion points, now is your opportunity. Go on. Paul Lemons as well.
Yeah, I have a question. Whether have you covered in your book the history of, we all looked at. I teach my students, the way from the Middle Ages, the moral Christian base of abuse, to 19th century ideas of addiction peeping up, and then 20th century addiction as a disease. And later on in the 80s, 70s, 80s, addiction as a brains disease. Do you cover any historical line?
We don't cover that kind of sweeping history of the addiction concept itself, and that has been done very well, including, for example, in a recent book by, remind me of that New York psychiatrist's name who's just produced
Carl Eric Fisher.
Yes, Carl Eric Fisher's book. If you're not aware of that, that's a splendid overview of the historical context. In our book, we cite famous histories of the brain disease concept, mainly by Courtwright, his work on the brain disease model, and a couple of others as well, which are largely critical of it.
Because I can imagine there are other mental health issues or health diseases. They may have suffered from the same development, confusion, etc., as is addiction as a concept. Do you have any ideas on that?
Can I? Oh, go ahead.
No, go on, Sally.
Oh, okay. Well, it's kind of interesting that Alan Leshner used to work for NAMI, which is the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and they used the brain disease model to describe schizophrenia, where I think it makes much more sense. And that was a major effort towards destigmatizing severe mental illness. And Alan Leshner, and I have to say, and someone else did cover it, there are good motives behind the concept of a brain disease to get it out of the criminal justice system, and again the moral failing notion. So I acknowledge that in our chapter, but that's where Leshner got it from. Really, that's where I think the idea to use again brain imaging, which is very compelling. So those are its roots. So if anything, severe mental illness kind of informed the kind of development of this rhetoric and the whole imagery of addiction. As far as NIDA is concerned, and its campaign to conceptualize it this way, which I do want to emphasize, it had good motives, for sure.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Stanton Peel, who asks, what is the significance of the reluctance of brain disease advocates to participate in this volume and indeed these discussions? Well, you were talking about reconciliation earlier, Nick. Do you want to take this?
Yes, I don't know. I think it's already been said. There's this enormous kind of sense of self-satisfaction. I think many advocates of the brain disease model think it's all sewn up. It's rather like the person who said it's the end of history.
Yeah.
There's nothing more to be said. Oh dear. It is unfortunate, but I mean, with guys like Marcus Heilig and his colleagues, and there are some very bright people around who tend towards neuroscientists who tend towards a brain disease explanation, but who are open to ideas and open to discussion. Whatever, although we've written, as it were, a rejoinder to the Heilig et al. Article in Neuropsychopharmacology, one must commend them for being open to new evidence and developing the model. I'd be interested to know what Matt thinks on this question of the reluctance and why it's so difficult to get. I mean,
briefly, please, because we have Richard and Alexander waiting as well.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, well, I will just say many Nora Volkov graciously declined, but some of the people that we wrote to didn't even give us a response. But we are really pleased. We think that the reprinted chapters we've got are very representative of the current thinking in the field, and of course we've got the two original chapters, including one from Kent Berridge, whose work has been enormously influential in this area. But yeah, that's my bit.
Okay, thanks. Can I go to Richard next, please? Richard Hammersley.
Yeah, it's not a question. And sorry, I'm a bit croaky today, but I think the history aspect of things is very important, and that the BDMA has risen along with the rise of a very large and significant biomedical psychopharmacological empire, where unfortunately it suits the needs of many people that to think of not just addiction but mental health problems in general as things that which can be treated with marketable products. I've just been reading Dickens, which is interesting because I'm kind of binge reading Dickens actually, and it illustrates quite neatly just the sheer amount of drinking and indeed other substance use in Dickens novels is pretty incredible to the modern eye, and it's why and how and what people do and how it's treated and how it's considered is very, very individualized compared with how we're trying to deal with things at the moment. Because one of the things that the BDMA does is try and homogenize responses to people's individual problems. So I really feel that BDMA is a 20th century idea. It's a modernism. And hopefully as we move further into the 20th century, although it's terrifying personally how far into it we've got already, things will change.
Anyone want to respond to Richard's comments briefly? If not, can we go to Alexander Nicolescu, please?
Yeah, hi, thank you all for writing this amazing book and doing this webinar. I have two questions. One is, I do think that the kind of collapse of the brain disease model is probably somewhat imminent, maybe on the order of decades, if only because I think its connection, as Richard mentioned, to market forces and just biomedicalization overall has become pretty apparent, and the promises offered by neuroscience really haven't borne out. So my first question is, how do you think the eventual conciliation between the brain disease and a much more realistic but complex psychosocial conception of addiction, how do you think that will be translated in biomedical understandings or teachings about addiction? Disclosure, I am an internal medicine resident physician. And then the second question is, what kind of work is being done empirically? I've only seen maybe one or two papers to demonstrate the more stigmatizing effects of the brain disease model as opposed to alternative conceptions. And is there any work kind of promised going forward on that?
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, so just to speak to the point of what are the prospects for reconciliation, I think I and many other people are doing work on the neuroscience of choice, particularly value-based choice, and I think that is the reason I'm interested in that is because I think it's the most realistic prospect of understanding, of reconciling, of understanding addiction, in particular, understanding how neurobiological disruption leads to leads to kind of this constrained behavior, which is characteristic of addiction, without it being indicative of a brain disease model. I realize that's just one part of your question, but that's the part I feel I can speak to. I noticed that Tony's got his hand up, so I'll shut up.
Tony.
I only put my hand up to make you shut up, Matt. That's the signal. Thanks. I mean, I sort of take it from a slightly different perspective. I think I can see that politics and policy probably will play a bigger role than the science in some ways. I think the science, as we've seen, the ideas around the different ways of thinking about addiction are already many and varied. I don't think it's an absence of good ways of thinking about the problem. I think the reality is more likely that over time things will just change and things will be tried by people that aren't academic scientists working in the field, And if those things work, then they'll be supported. And I think that'll just shift the lens in terms of what's considered important in terms of investment in research. I suspect that'll take a long time, but certainly in a UK context, looking at the role of public health and the framing of addiction as a public health issue, it seems to me that just takes time to shift. But I think politics and policy will play a much bigger role in any changes, if they do happen over time, than probably, unfortunately, scientific evidence.
Okay, Sally, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I agree with those comments. Also, I think, Neurobiological has been head of NIDA for going on 20 years. And I think when there's turnover, I mean, potentially, when there's turnover at the head of that agency, one would hope by someone who actually treats addicts. I mean, she's obviously a very accomplished person, and but the clinical experience, in fact, this is something one could study, but it's not worth the time, which is trying to prove or disprove my hypothesis that people who, so many people, at least in the US, who write about addiction have no clinical experience at all. And she is a psychiatrist, but has not worked with addicts at all. So hopefully someone who replaces her would have a more global understanding of the problem, as did her predecessors, actually. So that's one, that would be one variable that might lead to some kind of change. And the other, and you're right, whoever said that, the world is opening up a little bit to realize there are other ways of thinking about this. But the other thing, and this goes to the gentleman's point about how we're going to see this on a broader level, is that I think, the opioid crisis in the United States, and also believe it or not, the nomination or the election now of Trump, both those things coincided in terms of our understanding, or our trying to understand, why so many communities voted for him. And those are the communities that tended to have the worst opioid problems. And then that drew attention to I'll just use the shorthand here, but the deaths of despair paradigm. And so that opened up, I think, a lot more thinking about the concept of why people use drugs, as opposed to the fact that they do, that there's actually a logic behind it. And at the communal level, it's because there's people don't see much of a future. I mean, I can go on, but the obvious reasons of why epidemics start, why there's use on a grand scale, because people are in situations en masse that are, they find untenable, they can't cope with, they don't want to cope with. So that, I think that actually was a contribution. I mean, it's unfortunate the origin of it, but I think that was a big contribution to people thinking about addiction and being more sensitive to these larger contextual dynamics.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Nick, and then we've got a question by Mary Bailey, which is of treatment focus. So Nick first, please.
Well, my take on the way forward is this, that I mean, the key concept in the brain disease model, indeed disease model generally, is the idea of compulsion, which is used to explain why people continue to behave in ways which they know is doing them harm, right? That's the central problem of addiction. Now, if you go to the Addiction Theory Network website, which I recommend to you, which we've just established, I've got an article on there which talks about whether or not we're having a paradigm change at the moment. And the anomaly, in Kuhnian terms, is the evidence, the abundant evidence from, operant paradigms, contingency management, kind of things that Sally's been speaking about, that addictive behavior is voluntary and intentional behavior. So, you have the rather odd thing, if you think about it, of a disorder of voluntary and intentional behavior. And I think that's what we've got to get our heads around and start to try to understand how that is possible. just one possibility is in the field of behavioral economics. And there's a chapter there by J.D. Tucker and her colleagues from Florida on, looking at addiction from a behavioral economic, a choice perspective, but yet one which involves a disorder. So I mean that is the way if there is a paradigm change shift going to happen, that's it.
Okay, can I just, this might be the last question, but can I just ask the panel to reflect on Mary Bailey's question? What are the treatment implications, do you think, of these new ways of thinking about addiction that feature in your book? Can I ask Sally to maybe start?
Well, just more attention to the fact that, once people are stable, and they can do that in many ways. As I mentioned, I'm working in a methadone clinic, so that's the whole purpose of methadone, is to stabilize people. It's rare for someone to just get methadone and then everything works out in their lives. So, once people are stable, is to kind of backload the treatment a lot with rehabilitative efforts, basic, good cognitive behavioral, relapse prevention, a lot of family intervention. But people, I think of addiction as sort of two levels. The first is why people were drawn to excessive drug use. And I do believe in the self-medication model. And the second level, and one that perpetuates the addiction, is all the destruction they've done, to their lives while being addicted. So you've ruined your family, your choices, your health, go on and on and on. And so that needs enormous amount of repair. And so I think that's where the emphasis, we have to put more emphasis on that. I mean, it's not a new concept, for heaven's sakes, but probably not enough emphasis.
Okay, Tony, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, from a kind of a policy perspective, I think one of the things that strikes me from the book is that the variety of different ways there are of thinking about addiction, I think, probably just reflect the fact that it's a very complicated phenomenon. And I would suggest that when we talk about treatment, one of the most important things is, if we can't be clear from a scientific perspective what the phenomenon is that we're all talking about, and we can't come to terms on that, probably the most important thing is that we make sure we've got good funding in a range of different services and treatment approaches and so on, and recognise the fact that different people will find different journeys through their experiences with addiction, and be clear about the fact that it's okay for people, for individuals with addictions, to be thinking about their own experiences in different ways. I think one of the challenges with the BDMA is that definitiveness, and it's almost this sort of price of entry, if you like, that you have to accept that you've got a brain disease, which may be okay for some people, but could be extremely damaging for others. So I think the plurality, I'm going to struggle to say the word, the plurality of treatments is, I think, really quite an important thing.
Matt and Nick, would you like a word?
No, just thank everybody for attending, and buy the book.
I think that message has come across loud and clear. Okay, I think we're probably run out of time now, but thank you so much for attending our first event, and I look forward to seeing hopefully lots of you for Bruce Alexander on the 19th of April. Thank you so much. I'm going to stay online now, but I'm going to stop recording.